Prologue, the Naval War of 1812 Illustrated. The causes of the War of 1812 and the birth and development of the United States Maritime Forces. A quote from the Honorable Ray Mabus, Secretary of the United States Navy, from the preface of Yardarm to Yardarm. The United States is a maritime nation. This has been a fact throughout our history and remains very much the case today. The oceans connect us to the world, and they sustain our trade and economy. For the past 200 years, the world's oceans have also witnessed the presence and growth of the United States Navy and Marine Corps. On the waves, we have become what we are and will remain, the most formidable expeditionary fighting force the world has ever known. This is a journey that began in earnest during the War of 1812, the first true global conflict of our still young and expanding nation. In the wake of the American Revolution, the United States endured a period of great uncertainty. Although the 13 United Colonies had successfully won their independence, the new nation remained fragile and faced a number of unresolved matters. In an effort to address these issues, a convention was held in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, during which the old Articles of Confederation were replaced by a new constitution that vested considerable authority in the new centralized federal government, outlined the guaranteed rights of the American people, and provided for the common defense. Initially, this amounted to a small standing army, but no maritime force to protect the nation's coastal waters or its merchant marine. The vast majority of goods moved on water. Soon, there would be a need for maritime forces to protect this commerce, because only weeks after George Washington, the first president under the new constitutional system, was inaugurated in April 1789, the French people, inspired in part by the American Revolution, stormed the Bastille in Paris, beginning the French Revolution. That revolution plunged Europe into nearly a generation of unprecedented warfare that in the end left an estimated 5 million people dead. In 1789, the entire American population was less than 4 million. Had these wars not occurred, there would have been no War of 1812 in the United States. They were the root cause of it. Out of the turmoil of this era, the United States Navy and Marine Corps were born, and a precursor of the Coast Guard emerged. On the anvil of war, in the conflicts before and during the War of 1812, these armed services were hammered into the nuclei of what would become 2 centuries later the most powerful maritime forces the world has ever known. Under President Washington and subsequently the second president, John Adams, and his Federalist Party, a commerce-oriented, New England-centered party promoted by Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton that favored sound fiscal policies, a national bank, and a strong federal government and navy. The United States pursued neutrality through diplomacy and a naval program of military preparedness. A 10-year treaty negotiated with Great Britain just after the European hostilities began, the Jay Treaty, enabled the Americans to ply the seas freely and dramatically increase their commerce, in large part because the war swept much of the French and British carrying trade from the seas. Since U.S. government revenues were largely based on tariffs on such trade, federal coffers benefited accordingly. To watch over these revenue activities, Congress, under the guidance of the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, created, as part of the Treasury Department, the Revenue Cutter Service, precursor of today's Coast Guard, and authorized the construction of 10 armed cutters in the spring of 1790. For nearly a decade, these revenue cutters not only enforced tariff laws, but also provided the only naval defense of shipping and coastal towns for the nation. For a number of years in the Mediterranean, the Barbary states along North Africa have been raiding American shipping. To deal with this threat, Congress passed and President Washington signed the Naval Act of 1794, creating the United States Navy. It authorized the construction and manning of a number of frigates and the purchase of materials for larger ships of the line. As these ships came off the ways, Congress formally established the Department of the Navy on April 30th, 1798, and the Marine Corps 3 months later on July 11th. These frigates became the core of the new Navy. 6 would become famous in the War of 1812. They were designed by Joshua Humphreys, who was, ironically, a Quaker. Long in keel and narrow in beam, they were built to outmatch lighter European frigates by using heavy planking, coupled with an innovative diagonal scantling to reduce hogging from the additional weight. And they had the lines and carried the canvas to outrun higher-rated ships of the line, such as the British and French 74s. Although rated with 44 guns, these Humphreys heavy frigates could and often did carry several more cannon. Launched in Philadelphia on May 10, 1797, the United States was the first ship of the new United States Navy. Others followed. The U.S. frigate Constellation, rated at 38 guns, was built at Fells Point, Baltimore, under the direction of Colonel David Stoder and launched September 7, 1797. The U.S. frigate Constitution, another heavy frigate rated at 44 guns, was built at the Edmund Hart Yard in Boston and launched on October 21, 1797. The U.S. frigate Congress, rated 38 guns, was built in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, by James Hackett and launched August 15, 1799. The U.S. frigate Chesapeake, rated 38 guns, was designed to be a 44, but material shortages and budget problems cut her down to a 38. She was built by Josiah Fox at the Gosport Naval Yard in Norfolk, Virginia, and launched on December 2, 1799. The U.S. frigate President, the third heavy frigate rated at 44 guns, was built in New York City under the supervision of Foreman Cheeseman and launched April 10, 1800. Hammered into a fighting force on the anvil of war. Federalist diplomacy generally worked with Great Britain in the 1790s, but France was a different situation. The United States still owed France debts from the Revolutionary War, but chose not to repay them, arguing that they had been lent by the overthrown French monarchy, not the new revolutionary government. Moreover, the French viewed America trading with Great Britain, facilitated by the Jay Treaty, akin to supporting the enemy. In the closing years of the 18th century, French privateers and even warships began to attack American shipping, largely in the West Indies. Diplomatic efforts to resolve these matters failed, so the Navy sent several of its vessels to patrol the southern coasts and the Caribbean. The best known of the many naval engagements over this 2-year war involved the U.S. frigate Constellation 38 under Captain Thomas Truxtun. While patrolling the Caribbean on February 9, 1798, off the island of Nevis, she encountered and pursued the Sergent 36, a French frigate under Captain Michel Pierre Barreau. After a hard-fought hour-and-a-half running battle, Le Sergent struck, having lost 70 of its crew to the Constellation's 3. The captured ship was taken into the American Navy. 2 years later, on January 31, 1800, in the waters off St. Kitts, the Constellation, still under Captain Truxtun, encountered another French frigate, the Vengeance, under Captain Pitot, and gave chase, eventually engaging in night action. But, after suffering much damage, she escaped under the cover of darkness. The estimated casualties were 160 for the French and 40 for the Americans. Although the quasi-war was short, it brought the U.S. Navy significant victories and prizes, and the resulting Convention of 1800 resolved many of the issues between the two countries. One reason the French settled the dispute with America was that they had other, more pressing matters. Under Napoleon Bonaparte, the French invaded Egypt in 1798, hoping to weaken Great Britain by severing its land bridge to its empire in India and the East. But, in one of the most daring attacks in naval history,
British Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson sailed his fleet into Aboukir Bay at sundown, August 1st, 1798, and over the next 2 days captured all but 2 ships of the French fleet. There were an estimated 4,000 or 5,000 casualties in the Battle of the Nile, including over 1,000 killed when the French 120-gun flagship L'Orient dramatically exploded at night 5 hours after firing commenced.
With supply lines cut, the French retreated, and
In 1801, the belligerents negotiated a truce, the Treaty of Amiens, and during its 2-year existence, the British and French abuses of American sailors' rights and free trade greatly abated. Shortly thereafter, France, in need of funds to continue its wars, sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. Doubling the size of the country, the purchase also included New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi, where the last major American victory in the War of 1812 would occur. For many years, the Barbary states, present-day Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, had been demanding and receiving ransom and tribute payments from the United States in order to guarantee protection of American ships and seamen. These grew in size and by 1800 constituted a significant percentage of the total revenues of the federal government. The burden was tolerated because it was thought cheaper to pay tribute than fund a naval military solution. But the newly inaugurated third president, Thomas Jefferson, refused to pay. Thus rebuffed, the Libyan Pasha of Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli, declared war in May 1801.
Jefferson sent a U.S. naval force to the Mediterranean, including the U.S. brig Enterprise 12 under Lieutenant Andrew Sterrett, that engaged and defeated Tripolitan Corsair Tripoli 14 on the 1st of August just west of Malta, where she then made port. The following year, Jefferson built up the Navy's Mediterranean presence with some of its finest ships and captains under the overall command of Edward Preble on his flagship, the U.S. frigate Constitution 44. These ships and men became hallmarks of the War of 1812.
Constitution 44 under John Rogers, Constellation 38, Congress 44 under Stephen Decatur, Chesapeake 38 under Richard Morris, President 44 under Richard Dale and Samuel Barron, and U.S. brig Argus 18 under Isaac Hull. Other ships saw duty there: the U.S. frigate Essex 32, U.S. brig Siren 16, and the U.S. ketch Intrepid and the U.S. frigate Philadelphia 36 under Captain William Bainbridge.
The Navy used Sicily as its base of operations for refitting and reprovisions. The U.S. frigate Philadelphia grounded on shoals off Tripoli in 1803 and was captured, refloated, and taken into service by the Tripolitans. That same year, the Enterprise captured the Tripolitan ketch Mastico and renamed her U.S. ketch Intrepid. The following year, Commander Preble sent the Siren and Intrepid on a daring and successful raid to destroy the Philadelphia anchored in the harbor under the guns of Tripoli.
With men from both ships, including Thomas McDonough, Stephen Decatur took the Intrepid under the cover of darkness into the harbor, boarded and subdued the crew, and torched the ship and escaped. An action that Admiral Nelson reportedly acknowledged as the most bold and daring act of the age.
After continued military action, a peace treaty was signed in 1805, bringing an end to the First Barbary War. The following year, other pirates attacked the Enterprise off Gibraltar, but she beat them off and eventually returned home after an impressive 6-year tour of duty in the Mediterranean. Over the following years, the Barbary states resumed their old ways, but in 1815, the U.S. Navy put an end to these annoyances in the Second Barbary War.
A new century with renewed harassment of American ships and sailors. The opening years of the 19th century saw significant political changes both in Europe, where Napoleon named himself emperor, and in the United States, where Thomas Jefferson, as the leader of the Democratic Republicans, an anti-federalist party, and his presidential successor, James Madison, orchestrated a policy sea change. Unlike the Federalists, who championed commerce and military means to protect it with a strong navy, the Democratic Republicans favored an agrarian economy, defense retrenchment, reduced taxes, and a reduction of national debt. Relying on state militias for defense, they cut the National Army by 40% to only 3,300 men, and following the First Barbary War, laid up Navy ships and scrapped the Federalist plans for building ships of the line. Harassment of American ships and sailors during the second decade of the Napoleonic War began again in 1803, when war resumed between France and Britain. The new difficulties were compounded for Americans by the expiry of the Jay Treaty that had provided a degree of understanding between Britain and the United States about the rules governing neutrality.
In 1805, both Britain and France reconfirmed their respective strengths when Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson defeated the combined Spanish and French fleet off Spain's Cape Trafalgar, while just days before Napoleon triumphed at the important Battle of Ulm in Germany, and days after Trafalgar he conquered the Russo-Austrian armies at the Battle of Austerlitz in Austria, one of his greatest victories. Trafalgar was also a monumental victory for the British, but it cost Nelson his life. He was commanding his fleet aboard the 100-gun, three-decker HMS Victory and engaged with the French Redoutable, a 74-gun, two-decker under Captain Jean-Jacques Lucas, when he was hit by a sharpshooter in its fighting tops. The HMS Téméraire, another 100-gun, three-decker, joined the fight against the Redoutable, and after hours of lopsided battle, she struck, having lost 3/4 of her officers and crew dead or wounded, many of whom drowned when she sunk the following morning. For the United Kingdom, the Napoleonic War was a high-stakes endeavor in which the rights of neutral powers were easily ignored, if need be. Viewed in this perspective, the debate between the United Kingdom and the United States, and the methods employed by Parliament to try and restrict American trade, collectively known as Orders in Council, would appear almost civil, but Americans saw the situation very differently. The Orders in Council outraged the Americans. The British had blockaded France and all her European allies. Any vessel not complying with these orders was seized and the goods aboard condemned. In retaliation, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, which created a paper blockade around the United Kingdom and subjected any ship trading with it to seizure and condemnation. The difference between these blockades was simple. The British could enforce theirs, while the French could not, and thus most harassment the Americans experienced was with the British. Americans believed that the British had violated the laws of nations and had no right to interfere with American international trade. Historian Professor Donald R. Hickey estimates that on average, the British and French took 200 American ships annually between 1803 and 1812. While this is a great number, he reckons it was less than 5% of American shipping. Nonetheless, American merchants and their allies in Congress were furious. In addition, as Americans expanded settlements in the Northwest, present-day Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, and in the Southwest, Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida, then a Spanish possession, they became more outspoken about raids by Native American tribes. They believed the British were behind all these activities, supporting them with guns and ammunition. This constituency would be an important part of the war hawks. But the issue causing the greatest tension between the United States and the United Kingdom was impressment. To meet the demands of war, from 1793 to 1812, the Royal Navy grew from over 100 ships to nearly 600, from less than 40,000 sailors to over 110,000. During this same period, nearly 100,000 sailors perished, most from accident or disease. The work was dangerous, pay poor, discipline harsh, and desertion common, so impressment became necessary to fill out crews. Impressment provided an estimated 50% of the sailors in the Royal Navy in this period, while at the same time, about 500 sailors deserted each month. Admiral Nelson mused that without impressment, he had no idea how the British fleet would be manned. The British impressed an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 sailors from American ships during the war with France,
In defense of these actions, the United Kingdom doggedly maintained that the Royal Navy was merely recovering deserters and enforcing the British doctrine of perpetual allegiance, which denied the right of anybody born in Great Britain to become a naturalized citizen of another nation. The vast majority of impressments occurred on merchant ships, but there were even some involving the ships of the U.S. Navy. 4 touchstone events along the path to war were, at root, confrontations over impressment. These were the Baltimore Incident, the Leander murdered Pierce outrage, the Chesapeake Leopard affair, and the President-Little Belt conflict. Stepping stones to war. On November 16, 1798, 2 British frigates halted the U.S. sloop of war Baltimore as she was convoying a small fleet of merchant vessels into Havana. Her captain, Isaac Phillips, then allowed a British press crew to board his ship, muster his crew, and watch helplessly as the Royal Navy impressed 55 men enlisted in the service of the United States Navy. Although 50 seamen were eventually returned, Phillips was dismissed from the Navy for allowing such a gross insult to the American flag. Several years later, on April 25, 1806, 3 British ships, including the HM frigate Leander, 50, were stationed off Sandy Hook, New Jersey, enforcing the orders in council and impressing seamen. When the American cruiser Richard refused to heave to for the Leander, the British frigate fired on the American merchantmen and killed one of her crewmen. John Pierce, murdered Pierce, became a martyr. President Jefferson banished the Leander and the other 2 ships from ever entering American waters again, while the most rabid Anglophobes began to talk of war. The Chesapeake Leopard affair nearly did lead to war. In March 1807, 3 men enlisted in the U.S. Navy to serve on the U.S. frigate Chesapeake, 38, at the rendezvous in Hampton Roads, Virginia. The Royal Navy appealed for the return of these men as deserters from the British service, but as the superior officer aboard the Chesapeake, Commodore James Barron, refused to turn over the men since each was an American and each claimed to have been impressed into the Royal Navy. Months later, on June 22nd, when the Chesapeake put to sea bound for the Mediterranean, the HM frigate Leopard, 50, approached her off Cape Henry. The captain of the Leopard, Salisbury Price Humphreys, sent Barron a thinly veiled threat to give up the 3 deserters. Again, Barron declined to do so, and his refusal was met with a series of broadsides from the Leopard. The Chesapeake was unprepared for hostilities, and Barron quickly ordered the colors struck, but not before 3 Americans had been killed and another 18 wounded. The British then boarded and took off the 3 they sought, all of whom were in fact Americans. Plus, Jenkins Radford, who was British-born and had deserted from the HMS Halifax. Radford was returned to the Halifax, tried and hanged from its yardarm 2 months later. Although much of the nation cried out for war, President Jefferson instead again tried diplomacy, but, making no progress on that front, decided to bring what he perceived was America's economic weight to bear by cutting off American exports in the Embargo Act of 1807 and subsequent non-intercourse acts. But these not only failed to bring the British to the negotiating table, but caused considerable economic hardship at home and sharpened political division. One of the most notorious British vessels involved in impressment and enforcing the orders of council was the frigate HM Frigate Guerrière 38, which patrolled the waters around New York Harbor. In May 1811, Commodore John Rogers was ordered to take up his station in New York with the U.S. frigate President, 44, in hopes of driving off the Guerrière. En route on May 16, 1811, Rogers fell in with another vessel that he mistook for the Guerrière, and when the ship fled, Rogers pursued. By the time Rogers caught his chase, it was past dark and he could not observe the identity of his prey. When the Commodore hailed the other vessel inquiring as to its identity, he was met with cannon fire. Rogers responded. After several minutes, the President silenced the guns of her foe. In the morning, Rogers learned more. The ship was HM Sloop of War Little Belt, 20, and the damage he had inflicted was severe. 11 British seamen were dead and another 21 were wounded. It was England's turn to be outraged, but most Americans viewed the Little Belt confrontation as a chastisement for the Chesapeake affair. A divided and unprepared nation goes to war. On June 1, 1812, President James Madison, a leader of the Democratic Republican Party who had been inaugurated president in March 1809,
delivered a message to Congress.
After days of closed-door deliberation, Congress voted 59% in the Senate and 62% in the House to go to war. Probably the narrowest vote on a formal declaration of war in all of American history. The vote on war was largely along party lines, with Democratic Republicans voting for war and Federalists voting against Madison's war. And it well may have not passed but for an outspoken war hawks in Congress from the South and West. On 18 June 1812, Madison signed the measure and the United States was at war with Great Britain. 5 days later, in a seemingly unrelated move, Emperor Napoleon invaded Russia with his Grand Army of 600,000 men. His failure to take Moscow, his long disastrous winter retreat by year-end, and his own ultimate defeat in 1814 set the stage for Britain, freed of the European war, to deliver devastating blows in America during the closing chapters of the War of 1812. It is a wonder the young republic survived its decision to go to war. Fundamental problems, many long recognized before, surfaced early in the next 2.5 years of the war. The American Army, which had been reduced by the Democratic Republicans when President Jefferson took office at the turn of the century, had few officers with any recent military experience and many political appointees. The nation looked to state militias for defense, and some of the states were so anti-war they refused to muster the militia when the president commanded, and others, when mustered, refused to leave their state or invade Canada. The Navy was a shadow of what it would have been if the Federalist policies of the 1790s had been pursued by the Democratic Republicans. But they, laid up in ordinary, mothballed, blue water capital ships while they built their brown water gunboat navy. Importantly, since the federal government's revenues derive largely from tariffs on trade, years of trade restrictions, embargoes, and harassed sea lanes took their toll on the American economy. In 1790, before the European wars began, American trade totaled $43 million and generated tariff revenues of $3 million for the federal government. By 1807, these numbers had grown to nearly $250 million in trade and $16 million in tariff revenues. A year after the 1807 embargo was enacted, trade fell drastically and resulting tariff revenues dropped to less than half of what was received the year before. In the thick of the war, in 1814, the figure was even lower in spite of doubling the tariff rates at the beginning of the war. All of this brought the country to the brink of bankruptcy in 1814, a situation saved by a few individuals who provided needed funds. It also heightened domestic unrest and partisan division on many fronts. The first instance of this occurred only 3 days after war was declared, when the largest of 3 deadly riots broke out in Baltimore, pitting Democratic Republicans against Federalists presumed to be British sympathizers. More unrest and division would follow in one form or another throughout the war. In spite of these economic and social difficulties on the home front and lack of leadership in executing the war, the Navy and Marines, even though stunted by Democratic Republican policies, were in a much stronger position than the Army, for they still had a number of ships, and their officers and men had garnered invaluable experience and built esprit de corps in the quasi-war with France and the First Barbary War in the Mediterranean. Moreover, in marked contrast to the Royal Navy, the men in the American Navy and Marines
chose to serve. They were all volunteers. They and their ships had proven themselves under fire before and were prepared to do so again. The limitations of communication greatly complicated both diplomacy and war in the early 19th century and played havoc in the War of 1812. News of the declaration of war first reached London 6 weeks after the fact. The British, who announced their intention to cancel the Orders in Council, but not impressment, 2 days before war was declared and formally did so 5 days later, knew this news would take weeks to reach Washington, which it did on the 13th of August. Allowing additional time for news of a hopefully favorable American reaction, but eventually hearing none, the United Kingdom formally authorized general reprisals against the United States on October 13th, nearly 4 months after the declaration of war and the repeal of the Orders in Council. The same sort of complications caused by slow communications occurred all through the war and continued after the peace treaty was signed on Christmas Eve 1814 in Ghent, Belgium, and even after it had been ratified and proclaimed by both belligerents on February 18, 1815. It took another 4 months after that for the last American Navy ship, still capturing ships on the other side of the globe, to learn that hostilities had ceased. This is a production of the American Society of Marine Artists, the nation's leading professional, educational, not-for-profit marine art organization, made possible with the assistance of the United States Navy, United States Marines, and the United States Coast Guard, in conjunction with other leading national and international institutions, museums, and historical societies.